He was a ghost, a soldier with no name, hiding the weight of a secret war in his eyes. The police saw a threat and sent in their best weapon, a trained K9, to take him down. But as the German Shepherd approached, it didn't attack. It froze. What the dog did next left the entire town silent, because this was no ordinary soldier, and that was no ordinary dog. It was a reunion, 5 years after they were both declared killed in action. The humidity rolled into Harbor Point, Texas, the way it always did, not with a sudden crash, but as a slow, silent gray tide. It crept in off the warm, murky waves of the Gulf of Mexico, swallowing the spindly legs of the shrimping piers and the weathered signs of the bait shops, and then it bled onto the land. The haze clung to the salt-bleached planks of the boardwalk, softening the hard edges of the cannery, and muting the world until the only sounds left were the lonely cry of a gull and the steady groan of a shrimp boat straining against its ropes. The air carried a thick heat that felt heavy in the lungs, dense with the smell of salt, diesel, and the rich, organic scent of the tidal flats. In that hazy, spectral world, he was a statue carved from stillness. He sat on a splintered pier bench at the very end of the boardwalk, a solitary figure staring into the blank space where the sea blended into the sky. He wore simple civilian clothes, dark jeans, sturdy boots, and a plain gray jacket that failed to conceal the hard, disciplined frame beneath. For 6 straight hours, he hadn't moved, save for the slow, deliberate turn of his head. His eyes were locked on the horizon, a gaze so steady and intense it seemed to pierce the veil of humidity. He didn't sweat in the oppressive heat. He didn't read a book or check a phone. He just watched, his silence as deep and unsettling as the haze itself. To the people of Harbor Point, a town where everybody knew everybody else's business, he was an anomaly, a question mark. They watched him from the cool interiors of their shops and homes, their curiosity laced with a growing unease. His name was Jacob Riley. The name, like his clothes, was camouflage. To the world, he was a ghost, but to a select few in the Department of the Navy, he was Senior Chief Riley, a Navy SEAL on a mission so clandestine it didn't officially exist. His target was a rusty, barnacle-encrusted shrimper, the Gulf Viper, currently anchored just outside the bay. Intelligence suggested it was a key link in a network smuggling military-grade weapons into the country, hidden among the shrimp and ice in its hold. Jake's job was simple: observe, confirm, and report. Do not engage. Do not be seen. He was failing at the second part. Stillness, a prized virtue on the battlefield, was a liability here. In a town built on constant motion, the hustle of shrimpers, the chatter of neighbors, the tireless work of the tide, his absolute immobility made him a beacon. Across the street, in the bright, air-conditioned space of the Rusty Anchor Café, Maria Flores watched him through the large front window. Maria was the heart of this town. A woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and streaks of silver in her dark hair, which she kept tied back in a neat bun. She'd run the cafe ever since her husband, a shrimper, had been taken by the sea a decade ago. She was a good soul, quick with a warm smile and a full cup of coffee, but the Gulf had taught her to be wary, to respect the power of the unknown. And the man on the pier was an unknown. More coffee, Maria? A booming voice called from the counter. It was Bo, a burly shrimper with a thick white beard and hands as tough as leather. He'd been a regular since Maria was a girl. Maria turned from the window, her customary smile falling into place. Coming right up, Bo. She moved with an easy grace, pouring the dark, steaming liquid into his mug, but her attention was divided. Her eyes kept drifting back to the window, to the motionless figure on the pier. He's still out there, she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. Bo followed her gaze. The new fella? Yeah. Hasn't budged since sunup. Either he's waiting on the Lord, or he's trouble. Another regular, a younger man named Caleb who worked the docks, chimed in. Maybe his car broke down, or he's just enjoying the view. What view? Bo snorted. All you can see is haze. Nah, something ain't right about him. Look at him. Sits like he's got a steel rod for a spine. Doesn't even feel the heat. Maria felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Bo was right. The man wasn't just sitting. He was posted. It was a posture she recognized, a kind of coiled readiness she'd seen in the Coast Guard crews that sometimes came in for breakfast. He was a predator pretending to be a rock. Her instincts, honed by years of watching the moods of the unpredictable sea and the men who worked it, were screaming at her. This man did not belong. The silent vigil continued for hours more. The lunch rush came and went at the Rusty Anchor. A flurry of orders for shrimp po' boys and fried oysters. Through it all, Jake remained. Maria watched as the daylight began to fade, the gray haze turning to a bruised purple at dusk. The lights of the cafe cast a warm, inviting glow onto the damp street, a stark contrast to the cold, solitary figure at the water's edge. He wasn't asking for help. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was just there. And that was the most unsettling part. The town had a rhythm, a predictable flow, and he was a rock in the stream, disrupting everything. Maria thought of her husband, Mark. He had been a good man, steady and kind, but he had underestimated the gulf. She had promised herself she would never make that mistake. Never underestimate a silent threat. Finally, her sense of responsibility won out over her desire to let things be. Wiping her hands on her apron, she walked to the wall-mounted phone behind the counter. Her movements were slow, her face set with reluctance. She didn't like bringing the law into things, but the safety of her quiet town came first. She dialed the number for the Harbor Point Sheriff's Department. The phone rang 3 times before it was answered. Sheriff Matthews speaking. The voice was young, crisp, and professional. "Sheriff, it's Maria Flores at the cafe." "Maria, everything okay?" "I hope so," she said, her voice low. She turned her back to the few remaining customers, her eyes still locked on the man outside. "There's a man. He's been sitting on the main pier since sunrise. Hasn't moved. He's making folks nervous." There was a pause on the other end, then the sound of a chair scraping on a wooden floor. "All right. Can you describe him?" "Late 30s, maybe. Dark hair, fit, wearing jeans and a jacket. Nothing flashy. It's not how he looks, Sheriff. It's how he isn't. He's too still." "Okay, Maria. Thanks for the call. I'll drive down and check it out." "Be careful, Cole," she said, a note of genuine concern in her voice. "Always am," he replied before hanging up. In his small, tidy office, Sheriff Cole Matthews stood up and settled his service pistol on his belt. He was young for a sheriff, barely 30, with a sharp jaw and an eagerness in his eyes that hadn't yet been worn down by cynicism. He'd taken over the post a year ago after the old sheriff retired, and he was determined to prove he was up to the job. A strange man on a pier wasn't much of a crime, but it was a disruption, and it was his job to restore the peace. He grabbed his jacket, the silver star on his chest glinting in the office light. As he stepped out into the humid evening and climbed into his patrol car, his mind was already running through the possibilities: a drifter, a runaway, a private investigator. Whoever the man was, Cole Matthews was on his way to find out. The silent standoff in the haze was about to be broken. The patrol car's headlights cut through the thick gray air, sweeping across the wet asphalt before coming to a stop a respectful distance from the pier. The engine idled for a moment, its low rumble the only sound to challenge the mournful cries of the gulls. Then, silence. The driver's side door opened, and Sheriff Cole Matthews stepped out. The crisp lines of his uniform were a sharp contrast to the soft, formless haze. He paused, his breath fogging in the thick air, and took in the scene, the long, empty pier and the solitary figure at the end, as motionless as the pilings he sat beside. With a steady, measured pace, he walked toward the man. The sound of his boots on the damp wood was an authoritative rhythm in the quiet. He stopped a few feet away, careful not to crowd him, giving the man his space. It was a de-escalation tactic, something he'd learned in his training, but it was also a sign of caution. "Evening," Sheriff Matthews said, his voice calm and even. "Pretty sticky night to be taking in the view." Jake Riley didn't turn his head. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "The heat doesn't bother me." His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in the surf. It was the voice of a man who didn't use it often. In his periphery, Jake had seen it. A flicker of movement on the deck of the Gulf Viper. A small skiff was being uncovered near the stern. The mission was entering a new phase. He needed this interruption to be over, and fast. "This is a public pier, but you've been out here since sunup," Matthews continued, his tone friendly but firm. "Some of the local folks are getting a little concerned. I'm Sheriff Cole Matthews. You have any ID on you?" This was the critical moment. Jake's mind cycled through a dozen protocols. His real ID would blow everything. His fake ID was thin and wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. The best defense was a simple denial. "I don't carry any," Jake answered, his eyes still fixed on the distant shrimper. Matthews' posture stiffened slightly. The friendly tone receded, replaced by a steel note of authority. "You have no identification on you at all?" "No." "And your name?" A short pause. "Don. Simple, forgettable." "Don what?" "Just Don." Sheriff Matthews took a slow breath, the humid air heavy in his lungs. This wasn't going the way he'd hoped. Most people, when approached by a law enforcement officer, were either nervous or angry. This man was neither. He was a void, a black hole of calm that seemed to absorb the sheriff's authority and give nothing back. It was deeply unsettling. "Look, Don," Matthews said, shifting his weight. "We've had some unusual activity in the bay lately. Unauthorized landings, things going missing from boats. A stranger sitting in the dark for 12 hours staring at the water with no ID. It doesn't look good. It makes me think you might be involved." Jake remained silent. He could feel the sheriff's frustration building like a static charge in the air. Out on the ship, the skiff was being fitted with an outboard motor. They were getting ready to move. He couldn't afford to be hauled into the station for questioning. "I'm just passing through," Jake said, his words clipped. "Not looking for trouble." "Trouble has a way of finding people who sit in the dark," Matthews countered. "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me to the station until we can figure out who you are." Jake finally turned his head, and for the first time, Sheriff Matthews saw his eyes. They were a pale, incredibly clear blue, and they held an intensity that was like looking into the heart of a glacier. There was no fear in them, no anger. Just a cold, hard assessment. "That's not going to happen," Jake said softly. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. The confrontation had drawn a small audience. From the doorway of the Rusty Anchor Cafe, Maria Flores watched, a hand covering her mouth. Bo and a couple of other shrimpers stood behind her, their faces grim. And a little farther away, near a stack of old lobster traps, another pair of eyes was watching the scene with a completely different understanding. His name was Noah Evans. At 10 years old, he was small for his age, with a mop of unruly brown hair and big, dark eyes that missed nothing. While other kids his age were obsessed with video games, Noah was fascinated by history, especially military history. His grandfather, a retired Army engineer, had filled his head with stories of the discipline, courage, and quiet professionalism of soldiers. Noah had been exploring the docks, his favorite pastime, when he'd seen the sheriff's car arrive. Now he watched the man on the bench, and he didn't see a drifter. He saw his grandfather's stories come to life. He saw the man's posture, ramrod straight, relaxed but ready. He saw his boots, practical and solid, laced with military precision. And he saw the way the man met the sheriff's gaze, not with the defiance of a criminal, but with the unshakable confidence of someone who operated on a different level. "He looks just like the men in Grandpa's old photos," the boy thought. As the tension on the pier neared a breaking point, Jake's focus was split. He had to deal with the cop in front of him while tracking the real threat behind him. The skiff's motor had started. 2 figures were climbing in. They'd be making a run for the shore soon, likely to a pre-arranged spot along the coastline. He had to be free to follow. Sheriff Matthews saw the man's eyes flick toward the sea for a microsecond. It was the first break in his composure, the first clue that he was watching something specific. Matthews' hand instinctively moved to the radio on his shoulder. "All right, I've had enough," the sheriff said, his patience gone. "You're not giving me a choice." He was in over his head, and he knew it. This man wasn't a typical vagrant. He was something else, harder and more dangerous. Matthews didn't know what he was dealing with, but he knew he couldn't handle it alone. He needed backup. Sheriff Matthews' voice cut through the humid air, professional and clipped, but with an unmistakable undercurrent of tension. "Dispatch, this is Matthews. I'm on the Central Pier with a non-compliant subject, refusing to identify. I need a K-9 unit on scene for non-lethal deterrence. Over." The reply was a crackle of static, followed by a calm female voice. "Roger that, Sheriff. K-9 is 10 minutes out. Deputy Jenkins and Max are responding." Jake heard every word. His posture didn't change, but inside, a cold calculation began. A K-9 unit, that complicated things immensely. He could disable a small-town sheriff with minimal effort and be gone before anyone truly registered what had happened. But a dog was a different kind of problem. They were faster, more unpredictable, and subduing one without seriously injuring the dog or himself was a messy, loud business that would draw exactly the kind of attention he couldn't afford. Out on the water, the skiff had detached from the Gulf Viper. Its motor was a low thrum, almost inaudible over the lapping waves, as it began to move, not toward the main harbor, but east, toward a series of rocky coves. The handoff was happening, and he was stuck on a pier that was about to become the center of a small-town drama. His training screamed at him, adapt. He held his position, his face a mask of indifference, and waited. Watching from his hiding spot behind the lobster traps, Noah Evans saw the sheriff speak into his radio and felt a surge of adrenaline. This was getting serious, but his mind wasn't on the possibility of a fight. It was racing backward, trying to catch a fleeting memory that the stranger's face had sparked. The man's eyes. He had seen those intense, pale blue eyes before. Not in person, but in a photograph. A photograph in a faded, leather-bound book that was his most prized possession, his grandfather's scrapbook. He had to be sure. Without a second's hesitation, Noah slipped away from the docks, his small frame melting into the hazy streets. He ran, his sneakers pounding a frantic rhythm on the damp pavement, his breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. The town was quiet, its houses glowing with warm light, their residents oblivious to the drama unfolding at the waterfront. 10 minutes later, another pair of headlights pierced the gloom. A black SUV with Galveston County Sheriff's K-9 unit stenciled in gold on the side pulled up behind Matthew's patrol car. The engine cut, and a woman in tactical fatigue stepped out. This was Deputy Sarah Jenkins. She was in her early 30s with a lean, athletic build and dark hair pulled back in a tight, no-nonsense bun. Her movements were efficient and precise, her dark eyes taking in the entire scene with a quick, practiced assessment. There was a quiet confidence about her, the demeanor of a professional who was completely at ease in a tense situation. She opened the back door of the SUV, and the real power emerged. He was a magnificent German Shepherd, his coat a thick mix of black and tan. His body was a collection of coiled springs and powerful muscle, and he held his head high, ears erect, intelligent eyes sweeping the area. A tag on his tactical vest read, Max. He was beautiful, but he was also undeniably a weapon. He immediately sat at Sarah's side, perfectly disciplined, his focus entirely on his handler. "What have we got, Cole?" Sarah asked, her voice calm as she took a firm grip on Max's leash. "Male, late 30s, uncooperative," Sheriff Matthews reported, his relief at her arrival palpable. "Been sitting here all day. Won't give a name, no ID. I think he's watching the water, but he won't say why. My gut says he's trouble." Sarah's eyes settled on Jake, who remained on the bench, seemingly unaffected by their arrival. "Armed? Can't say for sure, but it's his composure that's getting to me. He's too calm." "They often are, right before they break," Sarah said quietly. She gave a soft command to Max. "Watch him." The dog's attention locked onto Jake, a low, barely audible rumble starting deep in its chest. Meanwhile, Noah burst through the front door of his small house, startling his grandfather, who was reading in an old armchair. "Whoa there, sport. What's the fire?" his grandfather asked. He was a kind man with a weathered face and a gentle smile, the source of all of Noah's historical knowledge. Noah didn't stop to answer. "The scrapbook, Grandpa, where is it?" "Same place it always is, in the study on the bottom shelf." Noah darted into the small, book-lined room that smelled of old paper and wood smoke. He dropped to his knees before the bookshelf and pulled out the heavy volume. Its brown leather cover was worn smooth with time. He laid it on the floor and began flipping through the stiff pages, his heart hammering against his ribs. He passed black and white photos of his grandfather as a young soldier, newspaper articles about local heroes, and letters from distant wars. Then he saw it. It was a clipping from a newspaper a few years back. The paper was yellowed at the edges. The headline read, "Hometown Heroes, SEAL Unit Rescues Hostages in Afghan Op." The photo was grainy, showing a group of formidable-looking soldiers in desert camouflage. But Noah's eyes went straight to the center. To a younger-looking man, his face streaked with paint, but his pale blue eyes were unmistakable. At his side, sitting with the same proud alertness as the dog now on the pier, was a German Shepherd. Noah's breath caught, his finger tracing the caption beneath the picture. Senior Chief Jacob Riley and his K-9 partner, Ragnar, credited with locating the hostages. He frantically scanned the article, his eyes devouring the words. It talked of bravery, of a daring rescue in hostile territory. Then he found the paragraph at the end, a somber update, added later. It mentioned that on a subsequent mission in the same region, Senior Chief Riley's unit was ambushed. In the ensuing firefight and explosion, his heroic K-9 partner, Ragnar, was lost and presumed killed in action. Noah stared at the picture, then back at the words, "Lost, presumed Kia." He looked at the face of the young hero in the photo, and the face of the silent, haunted man on the pier merged into one. It was him. The man on the bench was Jacob Riley. He was a hero, and back on the pier, under the cold, unblinking lights of the patrol cars, Deputy Sarah Jenkins gave a quiet order to Max. "All right, boy. Let's go say hello." Deputy Sarah Jenkins and Max moved as one, a seamless unit of handler and tool. They advanced down the pier, the tread of her boots and the soft patting of his paws creating a steady rhythm on the weathered wood. Max was in his element, his body low and tense, a deep, controlled growl vibrating in his chest. He was focused, energized, every fiber of his being locked on the target, sitting passively on the bench. For Max, this was a familiar routine. Approach, intimidate, and if commanded, engage. Jacob Riley remained seated. It was the most disarming posture he could adopt. He watched them come, his pale blue eyes unblinking. He didn't just see a dog, he saw a living weapon, honed by years of the same kind of training he himself had once overseen. He saw the tension in the animal's shoulders, the slight curl of its lip. His own training told him to get on his feet to meet the threat. But a deeper instinct, a dormant, long-buried hope, told him to wait. They were 20 feet away when the wind shifted. A slight breeze eddied around the end of the pier, carrying the humid, salty air inland. It also carried a scent, a unique, unchangeable signature coded into the dog's very DNA. The scent of his first partner, his alpha. The change was instantaneous and profound. Max's growl died in his throat, choked off in a dry hack. His forward momentum faltered, his paws scuffing on the slick planks. His head, which had been lowered in an aggressive posture, snapped up, and his ears, once pinned back, twitched and swiveled in confusion. He stopped dead. Sarah felt the shift immediately, a sudden lack of tension on the leash. "Max, forward," she commanded, her voice sharp and clear. The dog didn't move. For the first time in their 2 years together, it had disobeyed a direct order. Instead, it took a half step back, its head cocked to one side, its intelligent eyes wide with utter bewilderment. It whimpered. It wasn't the sound of aggression. It was a soft, high, questioning note that seemed entirely alien coming from the formidable animal. "What's it doing?" Sheriff Matthews muttered from behind, his own confusion mounting. On the bench, Jake saw the moment of recognition break through the wall of training. He saw the conflict in the dog's eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he extended his right hand, palm open and facing up. It was an invitation, a gesture of peace that transcended species. Max saw the hand and the whimper in his throat grew louder, more insistent. He pulled at the leash, not with aggression, but with a frantic, desperate urgency. He had to get closer. He had to be sure. Sarah stared, her professional composure beginning to crack. This wasn't in any training manual. Her dog, her powerful, disciplined partner, was trembling, its eyes fixed on the stranger with an expression she could only describe as yearning. Something ancient and powerful was happening in front of her. Something that had nothing to do with her commands or her authority. Trusting an instinct she didn't know she possessed, she let the leash go slack. Freed, Max moved forward, not in a lunge, but in a hesitant, almost reverent walk. He stopped just short of Jake, his body quivering. He stretched his neck out and sniffed the offered hand. He took one deep, shuddering inhale, then another. The scent was a key unlocking a vault of memories buried for 5 long years. Memories of desert sand, of shared rations, of the sound of a specific voice in the heat of a firefight, of a bond forged in combat. A low, guttural cry of pure, unadulterated grief and joy escaped the dog's throat. It closed the final distance and pressed its wet nose hard into Jake's palm. Then it buried its head against Jake's knee, leaning its entire weight into the man as if it feared the phantom would vanish into the haze again. It whined over and over, its powerful body racked with an emotion it couldn't contain. The small crowd of onlookers fell silent. Maria Flores' hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Beau's skeptical frown was gone, replaced by a look of slack-jawed astonishment. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a reunion. Jake's own iron mask of control finally broke. A deep, shuddering breath escaped his lips. He bowed his head, his fingers gently working their way into the thick fur of the dog's neck, scratching behind its ears in a way that was both brand new and 1,000 years old. His voice, when he spoke, was a raw whisper, rough with a pain and a love he thought he'd buried forever. It was a single name that held the weight of their entire shared history, a name that belonged only to them. Ragnar. He said it only once, but the name hung in the humid air, filled with the ghosts of shared battles and a loyalty that had cheated death itself. Deputy Sarah Jenkins stood frozen, the leather leash limp in her hand. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and shock. She had spent years with this dog. She had fed it, trained it, cared for it, and trusted it with her life. She knew its every command, its every signal, its every mood. She had called it Max. She thought she had healed it from the trauma its file had vaguely mentioned. But she realized now that she had never truly known it. Not the deepest part of it. The dog nuzzling the stranger with desperate affection wasn't Max. It was a ghost. It was Ragnar. And there was no question that it was finally, impossibly, home. She looked from the dog to the man, and for the first time she truly saw the profound, unbreakable connection between them. A silent, sacred language she would never understand. A stunned silence descended on the pier, a quiet so thick it seemed to absorb the haze itself. The confrontation was over, replaced by a tableau of disbelief. Jake Riley sat with one hand buried in the fur of the dog, now pressed against him, his own posture softening for the first time in hours. Sheriff Matthews stood by his patrol car, his mouth slightly agape, looking from the man to the dog and back again as if trying to solve an impossible equation. The townspeople, who had gathered to watch a potential arrest, were now murmuring amongst themselves. Their phones were raised not to record a scuffle, but to document a miracle. The story of the silent stranger and the police dog who knew him was already starting to move through the quiet veins of Harbor Point. Matthews finally found his voice, shaking his head to clear the confusion. "All right, I don't know what kind of game this is, but you still need to." He was cut off by the sound of an approaching vehicle, moving much faster than the lazy pace of normal Harbor Point traffic. A black SUV with no official markings and tinted windows that reflected the gray sky like obsidian mirrors came to a smooth, silent stop behind Sarah's K9 unit. The driver's side door opened and a woman emerged. She was of average height, dressed in a sharply tailored dark gray pantsuit that was both professional and practical. Her dark hair was in a tight, neat bun and her olive-skinned face was calm, her expression unreadable. She moved with a fluid, predatory grace, her sharp, intelligent eyes sweeping the scene and assessing every detail in a microsecond. She radiated an aura of absolute authority that made Sheriff Matthews' local power seem quaint by comparison. She walked directly to Matthews, ignoring everyone else. "Sheriff Matthews," she said, not as a question. She held up a black leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gold shield and credentials inside. "Special Agent Ava Chen, FBI, Joint Terrorism Task Force." Matthews' eyes widened. "The FBI? What is this about?" "It's about you and your officers interfering in a restricted federal operation," Chen said, her voice calm but with a blade of pure steel. She gestured with a nod of her head toward Jake. "Our asset was on assignment. You will stand down now. Your presence here has already compromised this entire surveillance." The words hit Matthews like a physical blow. Federal operation. Compromised asset. He suddenly realized, completely and utterly out of his league. He looked from the impossibly confident federal agent to the silent man on the bench, and a dozen confusing pieces of the puzzle began to slam into place. We got a call," he stammered. He wouldn't identify himself. "He was following protocol," Chen said dismissively. She then turned her gaze to Jake, giving a short, single nod of acknowledgement. Her focus shifted to Deputy Jenkins, who was still standing frozen, her partner's leash slack in her hand, but Sarah was no longer paying attention to the human drama. Her world had narrowed to the German shepherd she called Max. Her professional mind, reeling from the shock, was desperately grasping for data, for something tangible to explain the impossible event she had just witnessed. A memory surfaced through the fog of her confusion: the intake procedure, the vet checks, the mandatory microchip scan. Every K9 had one. Without a word to anyone, she turned and walked stiffly back to her SUV. She opened the passenger door and retrieved a handheld scanner from her gear bag. Her hand was not quite steady as she returned to the bench, her eyes fixed on the dog nuzzling Jake's hand, begging for more attention. Jake saw her coming. He saw the scanner in her hand and understood. He met Sarah's eyes, and his held a flicker of something she couldn't name. Sadness, perhaps, or a shared understanding. He gave a slight nod, consenting. Sarah knelt, her movements slow and careful. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. The dog glanced at her, then looked back to Jake for reassurance. She ran the scanner over the dog's shoulder. The device beeped once, loud in the quiet air. A string of data illuminated the small LCD screen. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat as she read the glowing text, her heart pounding against her ribs. Chip ID, 7F8E499B2. Designation, K9R4. Name, Ragnar. Handler, Riley, J. ID, 840,221 unit, NSWG. Status, Kia. Incident, iBlast, AFG date, March 14, 2020. Sarah read the lines again, and then a third time, but the words didn't change. The letters K, I, A, burned in her mind. Killed in action. This wasn't a retired dog that had been renamed. This wasn't a dog that had simply gotten lost and been found. This was a soldier, a ghost, a warrior who, according to the United States Navy, had died in an explosion on the other side of the world 5 years ago. The dog she had cared for, the partner she had trusted, the animal she called Max, had a story she could never have imagined. And the silent man on the bench was the only other survivor of that story. The truth, in all its impossible and heartbreaking glory, was now glowing in the palm of her hand. The air on the pier was thick with unspoken questions. Agent Chen had her phone to her ear, her back to the small-town drama, speaking in the low, coded language of logistics and acronyms. Asset is secure. Situation is fluid. Advise ETA for Xville. Her world was one of protocol and procedure, and the miracle that had just unfolded was simply an unforeseen complication to be managed. Deputy Sarah Jenkins, still holding the scanner with its impossible truth, approached her. Agent Chen, she began, her voice unsteady. You need to see this. His file says he was killed in action. Chen gave her a brief, annoyed glance. Files can be wrong, Deputy. Likely a clerical error that wasn't updated when he was recovered. We'll sort it out later. To her, the dog was a piece of equipment with a corrupted data file. She turned back to her call, dismissing the profound reality of the situation. Sheriff Matthews watched helplessly, a man who had lost all control of his own jurisdiction. He was no longer a figure of authority, just a bystander. It was then that a new voice, quiet but carrying the weight of years, cut through the tension. It ain't the file you should be worried about. All heads turned. An old man had detached himself from the small crowd of onlookers and was slowly making his way toward them. He was tall and weathered, his face a map of deep lines carved by sun and salt spray. He wore a fisherman's knit sweater and worn canvas pants. And he leaned heavily on a gnarled piece of driftwood he used as a cane. This was Mr. Henderson, a Vietnam vet who had spent the last 40 years of his life living a quiet, solitary existence at the edge of town. He rarely spoke to anyone, but when he did, Harbor Point listened. His eyes, pale and clouded with age, were fixed on Sarah, but his words were for everyone. You're looking at that dog and seeing a piece of government property, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. You're wrong. You're looking at a soldier who just found the only piece of his soul he left behind. Chen lowered her phone, a flicker of irritation crossing her features. Sir, this is a restricted federal scene. I'm going to have to ask you to. Henderson ignored her completely, his focus still on Sarah. You're his handler now, aren't you? You ever see him hesitate? Ever see him freeze for a second when a boat backfires or there's a loud noise? Sarah blinked, taken aback. She thought of a few incidents during training, moments she had dismissed as stubbornness or a lack of focus. A shipping crate dropped on the docks that had made Max flinch and cower for a full minute. His strange aversion to swimming in deep, dark water. Yes, she admitted. Sometimes. We've been working on it. A sad, knowing look came into Henderson's eyes. You think that's a training problem? He asked gently. Deputy, that's memory. That's the ghost of whatever put him in the ground in the first place. That ain't hesitation. That's PTSD. I've seen it in 100 good men. Never thought I'd see it so plain in a dog. He took another slow step, leaning on his cane. That bond between a soldier and his dog, especially in a place like where they served, it ain't like anything else in this world. That dog wasn't just trained to obey that man. It was imprinted on him. His voice, his smell, his heartbeat. For 5 years, this animal has been walking around with a hole in its life. And you've been calling the echo from that hole a behavioral problem. The old veteran's words hung in the humid air, simple, profound, and undeniably true. They landed on Sarah like a physical weight, shattering her professional understanding of her partner. Everything she had thought was a flaw was, in fact, a testament to a loyalty so deep it had survived death itself. Her eyes welled with tears, a mixture of awe for the dog and shame for her own blindness. Agent Chen was silent, her mouth set in a hard line. Her world of clean, logical protocols had no room for ghosts or imprints. But even she couldn't deny the truth of the scene before her, the powerful K9, now as docile as a puppy, refusing to leave the side of the man the government had declared dead. It was a quiet act of humanity that finally broke the stalemate. Maria Flori stepped out from her cafe, her face determined. She carried a large thermos in one hand and a foil-wrapped package in the other. She walked with purpose, her path taking her straight past the formidable FBI agent and the humbled local sheriff. She didn't spare them a glance. She stopped in front of Jake, who looked up from the dog, his expression wary. You haven't eaten all day, Maria said, her voice soft but clear. It wasn't a question. She held out the food. It's a brisket sandwich and the coffee's hot. Best in town. It was more than food. It was an apology for her earlier suspicion. It was a gesture of welcome. It was a clear and simple statement from the heart of Harbor Point. You are not a threat. You are one of us. For the first time since he'd arrived, a genuine emotion flickered across Jacob Riley's guarded face. It was gratitude. He took the food, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice thick. Maria just nodded, her eyes drifting down to the magnificent dog who looked up at her, its tail giving a slow, hesitant thump. She had called the police on a ghost, and in doing so, had helped bring a soldier home. Unseen by the tense group on the pier, another observer had been watching the entire scene unfold. He wasn't hiding behind lobster traps or peering from a diner window. He was in a second-story office overlooking the docks, a digital camera with a powerful zoom lens resting on the windowsill. This was Alex Ramirez, known to his small but growing online following as R. A man in his late 20s with a restless energy and a passion for storytelling. He ran the Harbor Light, a local news blog and podcast. He wasn't a traditional journalist, but he had a keen eye for a meaningful story. And the scene below was the story of a lifetime. He had filmed it all. The tense arrival of the K9 unit, the dog's inexplicable hesitation, the emotional moment of contact, and the single, whispered name that changed everything. Ragnar. Back in his office, heart still pounding, Alex worked fast. He knew what he had. It was lightning in a bottle. He edited the footage on his laptop, leaving the raw, trembling emotion of the moment intact. He added simple text overlays for context. Harbor Point, Texas. An unidentified stranger. A police K9 is sent to confront him, and then the powerful final caption. But what happens when a soldier's dog remembers his ghost? He titled the video The Harbor Guardian and posted it to his blog and all his social media channels with a single hashtag, #Port, Isabel, Miracle. Then he sat back and watched the internet do its work. The fire started with a spark. First, it was shared among the residents of Harbor Point, confirming the whispers that were already spreading through town. Within an hour, it was picked up by a Houston news aggregator. From there, it exploded. The numbers on Alex's screen began to climb at a dizzying rate, a hypnotic cascade of views, likes, and shares. 10,000 views became 50,000. 50,000 became 500,000. By the time 2 hours had passed, the video was feral. It was no longer a local Texas story. It was trending nationally. A famous actor with 50 million followers retweeted it with the caption, "This is the America I believe in." A retired 4-star general posted it, writing, "The bond forged in combat is eternal. Do the right thing, Navy." The comment section was a tidal wave of emotion. People shared stories of their own pets, their own family members in the military. Veterans from every branch of the service wrote about their own K9 handlers and service animals. Photos were posted of soldiers and their dogs from Vietnam to Afghanistan. The video had tapped into a deep, universal wellspring of love for soldiers and the animals who served beside them. Jacob Riley and Ragnar were no longer a man and a dog. They were a symbol. They were the embodiment of loyalty, sacrifice, and a love that had literally conquered death. The nickname Alex had given the video stuck. They were the Harbor Guardians. The public outcry was swift and uniform, directed at any official channel people could find. The Facebook pages of the Galveston County Sheriff's Department and the United States Navy were flooded with thousands of comments, all carrying the same message: do not separate them. Let the hero have his dog. On the pier, Agent Chen was trying to coordinate Jake's extraction. The mission was scrubbed, the targets likely scattered to the winds the moment a uniformed officer arrived. Her priority now was to get her asset out clean and quiet. But her phone, once a tool of command, was now a source of chaos. It was buzzing and chiming nonstop. A priority alert came through, not from her direct superior, but from the FBI's Public Affairs Division in Washington, D.C. "We have a situation," the tense voice on the other end said. "A video is going viral. It involves your asset and a local K9. It's explosive. The director has been briefed." Chen's blood ran cold. She quickly pulled up a news feed on her phone. The first thing she saw was the video. She watched the grainy footage, her professional objectivity warring with the undeniable power of the scene. She saw the raw, unedited reunion, an event she had witnessed firsthand, but was now seeing through the eyes of the entire world. Then she made the mistake of looking at the comments. "If they take that dog from him, we riot. This man and his dog are national treasures. Protect them at all costs. I'm a veteran. I'm in tears. God bless them both." Chen felt a pit form in her stomach. She was a woman who dealt with events, threats, and protocols. She understood geopolitical struggles and terrorist cells. But this was a different kind of power, one she was not equipped to fight. It was the power of a perfect story. Her objective had been to retrieve a government asset in a K-9 unit designated VLR-29. But that was no longer possible. In the court of public opinion, Jacob Riley was a national hero and Ragnar was his loyal companion, returned from the grave. To follow protocol now, to separate them, to treat Ragnar as a mere piece of equipment to be reassigned, would be a public relations catastrophe. It would paint the FBI and the Navy as monstrous, heartless bureaucracies. The story would be on every news channel for weeks. She looked over at Jake, who was drinking the coffee Maria had brought him, with Ragnar resting peacefully at his knee. They weren't a man and a dog on a pier in Texas anymore. They were an idea, a symbol. Special Agent Ava Chen, a woman who had faced down armed threats without flinching, recognized a battle she could not win. The mission was over. The official plan was dead. And the fate of one Navy SEAL and his dog was no longer in her hands, but in the hands of millions of strangers on the internet. On the pier, the world seemed to hold its breath. Special Agent Ava Chen stood apart from the others, her phone once again pressed to her ear. But her tone had changed. She was no longer a field agent managing an exposed asset. She was a strategist advising a king on how to avoid a disastrous political checkmate. "Yes, sir, I understand protocol," she said, her voice low and firm. But protocol didn't account for the asset and the K-9 becoming the two most beloved figures in America overnight. The narrative is out of our hands. They are an icon now. Sir, with all due respect, my recommendation is the only viable path. We officially retire K-9R4, effective immediately, on humanitarian grounds. We release him to the permanent care of Senior Chief Riley. We don't fight this. We embrace it. We make this a story about the Navy taking care of its heroes, both human and animal. She listened intently for a long, tense minute. The fate of a man and his dog, once decided by an explosion years ago, was now being determined by a bureaucrat in a quiet office a continent away. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you, sir. I'll handle it." She ended the call and walked over to Jake, who had risen to his feet, Ragnar still pressed against his leg. For the first time, Chen's expression was not one of stern authority, but of something closer to weary respect. "It's done," she said. "The paperwork will be a nightmare, but the decision has been made. He's yours, Senior Chief. K-9R4 Ragnar is officially retired. He belongs to you." A wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over Jake. He looked down at the dog, whose tail began to beat a steady rhythm against his leg, as if it understood. He had never expected this. In his world, you followed orders, and you accepted loss. This felt like a violation of the natural order of things, a miracle he didn't know how to process. Before he could find the words, a new sound began to build in the distance, the rhythmic thumping of rotor blades. It grew louder and soon a shape emerged from the low clouds. It was a U.S. Coast Guard helicopter, a striking orange and white Jayhawk, perfectly at home in the maritime landscape. It began to descend toward a small clearing near the docks. The powerful downdraft from its blades churned the haze into a vortex and sent waves slapping against the pilings. It was his ride. The people of Harbor Point, who had been watching from a distance, now drew closer, not as suspicious onlookers, but as a silent, respectful honor guard. Jake knew he had to say his goodbyes. He turned first to Deputy Sarah Jenkins, who was looking at Ragnar with a sad, proud smile. He held out his hand. "Thank you for taking care of him," he said, his voice full of a gratitude he couldn't fully express. Sarah shook his hand firmly. "I was just keeping him safe," she answered, her eyes shining. "I didn't know who he was waiting for. I do now." She knelt and gave Ragnar one last scratch behind the ears. "Be good, you old ghost." Next, he faced Mr. Henderson, the old veteran who simply nodded. A universe of shared understanding passed between the two men. "Fair winds, son," Henderson said, the traditional seaman's blessing. "Thank you for speaking up," Jake said. "Truth doesn't need much volume," the old man replied. Then, a small figure pushed through the crowd. It was Noah Evans, clutching his grandfather's scrapbook to his chest. The boy stopped in front of Jake, his eyes wide with awe. Jake's guarded expression softened completely. He crouched down, bringing himself to the boy's level. Ragnar gently nosed Noah's hand. "I hear you were the first to figure it out," Jake said, a genuine smile touching his lips. Noah nodded, momentarily speechless. He opened the scrapbook and pointed to the yellowed news clipping. "I saw your picture," he whispered. "It said you were heroes." Jake looked at the image of his younger self, a man from another lifetime. Then he looked at the bright, serious face of the boy before him. Heroes are just people who have good partners watching their backs, he said, ruffling Noah's hair. Thank you, Noah. Finally, he stood and faced Maria. He held out the empty thermos. Best coffee in town, he said. You were right. You're welcome back for a cup any time, she said, her voice warm. Both of you. The helicopter's ramp was down. It was time to go. Jake took one last look at the small town, at the faces of the strangers who had become his unlikely allies. He gave them all a single, grateful nod. Let's go, boy, he said to Ragnar. The dog followed without hesitation, trotting up the ramp into the noisy bay of the aircraft. Jake followed, and as the ramp began to close, he looked back at Harbor Point, where he had arrived a ghost, and would leave a man made whole again. The helicopter lifted off, banking out over the Gulf. Through the window, Jake watched the small town recede below, the lights of the rusty anchor a single, warm beacon in the fading light. He put an arm around Ragnar, pulling the dog close as the coastline disappeared into the haze. The mission was over, but a new one was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, Harbor Point did not forget. Led by Maria and Mr. Henderson, the townspeople raised enough money for a small bronze plaque. They had it installed on the back of the splintered pier bench, the very spot where the stranger had kept his silent watch. It read, "For the guardians who watch over us, seen and unseen, and for the loyalty that leads them home."